You're listening to Code Red with Secure America Now, the largest national security grassroots army.
Welcome to the Code Red podcast. Today we are honored to have with us one of our nation's leading national security experts, Dr. Michael Makovsky. Michael is president and CEO of the Jewish Institute for National Security of America, JINSA. Michael earned advanced degrees from Harvard University and the University of Chicago. Michael is widely published, and his expertise is sought after by members of Congress and government officials. Michael, thank you for spending some time with us today.
Thank you, Alan, and thanks for the very generous introduction. Thank you.
Michael, on October 7th, 2023, Hamas launched a brutal attack on Israeli civilians. Can you explain to our audience who Hamas is and why they did what they did?
Yeah. Well, Hamas is a Sunni Islamic jihadi terrorist organization, is recognized by the United States or designated by the United States as a terrorist organization. It is essentially the Palestinian chapter of the Muslim Brotherhood, which has which has chapters in other countries and has threatened other regional regimes. And its founding charter is not only calls for the elimination of Israel, but also for the killing of Jews, and it seeks essentially a Muslim caliphate, and it is backed by Iran, and it is backed by Qatar, and is also by the Turks. But it has been mostly trained, and its military weapons have been supplied mostly by Iran. So that's who it is, and what it sought to do is a good question. But since it took power, it controls the territory of Gaza. It took it over. It won legislative. So Israel was controlling Gaza from 1967 to 2005 when they unilaterally disengaged. There were legislative elections in Gaza. Hamas won those elections, beat Fatah, and then it violently threw out Fatah and took over Gaza in 2007. Ever since then, it has been attacking Israel as part of really its charter, and it seeks to eliminate it. And it sought to really take over a lot of towns and free Palestinian prisoners.
You mentioned that it is affiliated with Iran. Can you go a little deeper into that aspect of the Hamas DNA? What does that mean? Is it an arm of Iran? Is it an ally of Iran? What connects it to Iran?
Well, the Iranians supply it with most of their weapons, so the overwhelming amount of the weapons. It is trained by the Iranians. Hezbollah, which is maybe Iran's chief proxy in the region, which is Shia, like the Iranians, it trains them. It works particularly, I'd say, closely with Iran and Hezbollah. It is, I wouldn't put it in the same par in status as with Hezbollah, which was created, as my colleague General Yaakov Amidror said, the former national security advisor in Israel said, Hezbollah was created to protect Iran. Hamas wasn't, but it has been a very useful tool for the Iranians. It is a Palestinian entity, and it has certainly been a means for the Iranians. It has been one of Iran's proxies in the region that he uses to attack and threaten Israel, and has also been a means for the Iranians to exert a lot of influence in Palestinian politics and dynamics in the region.
In the United States media, there's been quite a bit of coverage of another group called the Houthis, who are disturbing shipping in the Red Sea. I saw one comment saying that they basically, through their activities, have shut down the Suez Canal. Can you
Right.
explain again, what are the Houthis up to? Why are they involved in all of this? And is there a connection to Iran?
Yeah, so they also are a Iranian proxy. They don't control a whole country, like let's say Hamas controls Gaza and Hezbollah dominates Lebanon, but they are a major player in Yemen, and they control a lot of Yemeni territory, and they have served, and they are completely armed by the Iranians, and they have served as a proxy for the Iranians in Iran's efforts at regional destabilization, including against Iran's enemies, the Saudis and the Emiratis, and those two. And the Houthis fought a war, or I should say, the Saudis and the Emiratis fought a war for a period of time in Yemen. I mean, Yemen. If I may, one of the things I think it's important for Western audience to understand, if I may just step back for 1 second, is that when we're thinking about the Middle East, we're not thinking of nation states generally like we think of nation states in the West. The only country there are a few. Israel is probably the leading example, what I would consider a real nation state. Um, you might say Egypt also in the region, but a lot of these countries are just kind of amalgams of tribes. A number of them are artificial creations that came about after World War One. I mean, Yemen has its own history where you also have British forces there a lot longer, and the Emirati area also had that. But if I to generalize, these are not. This area was almost all Ottoman before World War One, and in different periods of time since World War One, there were these creations of these states. Some more functioning than others. Israel is the most functioning, but you think of Yemen, and you look at some of these other countries. The same applies to Lebanon and Syria, Iraq. They're inco. It's as if their borders were drawn by a drunken blind cartographer, and they there wasn't always good rhyme or reason to how these countries were put together and who was ruling them. And the British and others are at fault at this. So the Iranians take advantage of this fact, and they have backed in different of these countries in Iraq and Lebanon and Yemen major groups that then they arm and they use to help dominate the rest of the country, even if the groups sometimes are majority or sometimes are minority. But that's why you have such fractiousness in these different countries, and the Iranians have really capitalized on this situation. By the way, Iran itself could be argued, although it has a long history of Persia, the way its borders are and its ethnicities, it might not be a coherent state either, by the way, but that's another story.
Um, why should Americans be concerned about what is going on, specifically in the war with Gaza, but also in the broader issue of relations involving Iran?
Yeah. Well, look, I would say America has at least 3 or 4 major foes in the world that it has to address. China, I think, is the biggest. The Russians, the North Koreans are a significant problem. And in the Middle East, it's Iran. They are our biggest foe in the Middle East. We have historic interests in the region because of Israel, because of the oil, because it is a source of Islamic extremism. because of its geography. You mentioned the oil earlier, about even the transit of goods through that area is also very important. So and Iran is our primary foe in the region. Their interest is to expel us from the region. They are, as we all know, as I'm sure your listeners know, an a Shia Islamic extremist entity, which is one of the chief sponsors, or the chief sponsor of terror in the world. They try to kill and abduct American citizens on our soil. They attack our troops regularly in the region, and they are our closest allies in the region's main enemy, like Israel's main enemy, and the Saudis and the Emiratis, and so on, and the Egyptians. So it is our interest to weaken them. It is our, and also for humanitarian reasons. Obviously, they're a tremendous oppressor of their people, men and women. But as we've seen in the last couple of years, particularly, maybe grotesque how they treat their women. So we have an interest in the Middle East, like a lot of international relations, is a zero-sum game. So it is our interest, first of all, that our closest ally in the region, Israel, is secure, and that it restores its sense of security and deterrence, which it lost on October 7th. And if it loses this war in Gaza, then its enemies, which are also our enemies, such Iran, is a winner. So, and if Israel wins, I mean, I hate to simplify foreign relations like this, but sometimes some of it is rather simple. If Israel wins, we win. If they lose, we lose, and our enemies gain. And also, it not only affects our situation in the region, but all our other foes like China and Russia and so on are looking at how we're dealing with this, and it affects the way they look. Because if we're not going to stand by the Israelis, which are widely seen in the world as one of our closest allies in the whole world, then the Russians aren't going to think we're going to stand by the Ukrainians. The Chinese aren't going to think we're going to stand by the Taiwanese. And so, and one last point I'll just make, I think also at stake, besides the strategic concern, is I think the rhetoric from Israel is accurate. I do believe this is a civilizational war, and if the jihadi extremists, and these are people who have no tolerance for gays, are misogynists, treat their women terribly, who don't mind raping, killing babies in front of their parents, parents in front of their kids. If those kind of people win, it's terrible for the United States. It's not the kind of world we want to live in.
When you say that that America needs to support Israel, what do you mean by that? Has Israel ever requested American troops come into Israel and support them? Are we talking about armaments? What are we talking about in terms of support?
Yeah, it's a good question. Look, Israel historically does not ask for U.S. troops. I do think this war has exposed a little bit, to be candid, this Israel's motto, we defend ourselves by ourselves. I think that's been a little exposed as a bit of a motto, and less reality, because I think they need the United States probably more than they probably realized on October 7th. But that said, they don't ask for U.S. troops at all. And I think there are a few main areas they need. They're not asking, they want U.S. weapons. That is the primary thing they want. I was in Israel a few weeks ago. I've been in Israel 3 times since October 7th. I hear the same thing every time. We need ammunition, we need ammunition, we need ammunition. They're very grateful for the ammunition that the U.S. supplied. And I give Biden a lot of credit from day one. He stood by Israel, and he has been, and the resupply of weapons, of ammunition was quick and comprehensive. However, I also hear it's not enough, and they need more. And it's not just that they need more for Gaza, but as we might talk about, it's up to you, of course, Alan, for a possible war with Hezbollah in the north. And so that is the number one thing they need. I think they need a couple other ways of support. As we've seen in recent days, we see increasing disputes between the United States and Israel over Rafah, that Israel, the last bastion of Hamas control in Gaza. And I think the more, as I think Netanyahu, the prime minister of Israel, correctly pointed out the other day, the more they're seen perceived as daylight between the two countries, between the United States and Israel, the harder the negotiations it is with Hamas. They'll hold out for more. I think the closer, and I think sometimes the U.S. forgets this. Certainly, there was the case with Obama, but I think now we're seeing this with Biden. The more daylight between America and Israel, the more it emboldens our enemies, and really it makes it more challenging, I think, to resolve this war and to have peace in the region. A third way they need U.S. support is in the UN and in international bodies, and that I think the administration has done a pretty good job of. But they need more. Israel needs more weapons, and I think what we see lately, they need diplomatic support. The whole world, particularly Hamas and Qatar and the Iranians, need to see that the United States is standing by them. Israel.
You mentioned a couple of times Hezbollah, and Hezbollah, you mentioned Yaakov Almidraw talking about Hezbollah, why Hezbollah was created. Can you go into a little more detail? Where is Hezbollah based, and why is their threat militarily greater than Hamas?
Yeah, because actually, for all the focus on Gaza, this is really the big issue. I think that looms more significantly than Gaza. It's based in Lebanon, Hezbollah. It is a Shia, like the Iranians are. They're Shia Muslims. It's a much more advanced military than their fighters. They're also a designated terrorist organization by the United States. They are the dominant entity that controls Lebanon. They, to give you an idea, between them and Hamas, on October 7th, let's say Hamas had 20,000 rockets. Hezbollah had an estimated 150,000 to 200,000 rockets. And what might be even more significant is they have a few hundred of these precision guided missiles. And Israel doesn't have, even though they have a very advanced air defense system, Iron Dome being the most famous element of it, Israel doesn't have enough interceptors, doesn't have batteries, air defense batteries to withstand that sort of onslaught if Hezbollah, if there'd be a war with Israel and Hezbollah. Now, there are two main issues with Hezbollah today. There's the near term, and I would call the medium term. The near term, which is what we're seeing in the news and the back and forth almost every day between Israel and Hezbollah, is because it doesn't get enough attention, but I know you know this, Helen, is that there's been a displacement since October 7th. I've seen different numbers. 150,000 Israelis. I've seen more. I don't know exactly what the exact number is. But of course, on October 7th, all those southern kibbutzim and towns near the Gaza border, they evacuated during the beginning of the war. Some of them are starting to come back. But then shortly there, almost immediately, there was an evacuation of a lot of Israeli northern towns on the Lebanese border, some voluntarily and some involuntarily. And they haven't come back yet. And because the fear was, there were a couple fears. One, that Hezbollah would try to do the same thing as Hamas. And it's not a crazy idea because they built these big tunnels that Israel discovered about 5-6 years ago. I think about 7 of them. And their aim was to let terrorists go through from Lebanon into northern Israel to take over Israeli towns. So that was one fear. The second fear was that Hezbollah would get into a major war with Israel, so you want to evacuate the civilians. So in the near term, what Israel is trying to accomplish in their back and forth with Hezbollah is to clear out effectively a buffer zone of about 10 to 13 kilometers north of the Israeli border with Lebanon of Hezbollah fighters. Why that amount? Because that's roughly the distance, the range of these anti-tank missiles that have done some damage in Israel that they don't really have a counter for, that the Israelis don't. That is the near-term thing, and Israel's been pounding the south. They're killing Hezbollah, particularly their Radwan forces, their special forces, in that southern area. But they're hitting beyond that. As we've seen in the news, they've killed Hezbollah commanders in Beirut. So they have been going after Hezbollah. They've killed I saw it today. I think it was reported over 300 Hezbollah fighters, which for Hezbollah is a lot. Now, the hope is, and you have in the U.S. envoy Amos Hochstein that is shuttling back and forth in Lebanon and Israel to try to work something out. The Israelis don't want a multi-front war. They don't want to have to deal. I mean, they have it back and forth, but they'd rather not have anything major until they finish with Gaza. Hezbollah and Iran have made it clear that they don't want a war with Israel now, because if they did, they would have initiated, I think, already. So there's been this back and forth. You could have a war, God forbid, tomorrow, if let's say one of something that rocket or something that Hezbollah fires, it's a Jewish school, I mean, an Israeli school or something, or a bus that kills a lot of civilians, all bets are off. But barring a tragedy like that, Israel is trying to bully Hezbollah to move back their forces. If they do that, then the people in Israel's northern towns will be more comfortable coming back. I think it's possible that could work. If they don't, then Israel will have to use ground forces. That is the near term thing. The longer term thing, and I'm sorry to keep going on this, but is the longer term. I mean longer term. I don't mean too long. I mean more like a year or two. I don't think Israel is going to accept Hezbollah anymore, living on its borders for couple of reasons. One, I think October 7th taught them you can only live next to genocidal, jihadi, Iran-backed terrorist organizations for so long, and then it doesn't become tenable. So I think just like they're clearing out Hamas in the south, because that was triggered by a Hamas invasion, I think Israel, they haven't made a decision that I know of, but they're going to have to seriously think, and I think they're going to have to do this probably. They're going to have to go back. They're going to go Hezbollah. The second issue why they might have to do it is Hezbollah's fundamental existence is to act as dry powder for an Israeli attack on Iranian nuclear facilities. Iranian nuclear facilities, that threat is not subsided, but has risen. So that clock is still ticking. I think Israel's going to need to take care of that. The question is, do they take care of that first and then go after Hezbollah if Hezbollah attacks them, or they go after Hezbollah and they go after Iran? I don't think they've decided any of that, but I think that is the big issue, and that's what U.S. policymakers have to be thinking about it, how we help Israel prepare for such a conflict.
You mentioned that you've been to Israel during the war 3 times. What is the attitude of Israelis at this point? How are they withstanding this war in Gaza, threat from Hezbollah? What is the mental attitude of the Israelis?
Well, from what I could tell, and when I go, just to begin, I generally meet with civilian or military leaders. I do talk to people. I have relatives there and friends. Look, I think Israel, there are a couple things. This October 7th was a phenomenal trauma for this country that Americans still haven't appreciated. It shattered their sense of security. It shattered Israel's sense of deterrence. Israel stood 10 feet tall in the eyes of a lot of its neighbors, and it didn't on October 7th. It was unfathomable how Israel allowed such an invasion to take place, and how it allowed these terrorists to stay there for as long as they did, till they killed about 1,000 of them. There was and Israel looks at the Palestinians now very differently. Whether you were on the right or the left before October 7th, there's no question there's a shift to the right politically. The sense that the idea that we keep hearing from the U.S. or other Westerns about a Palestinian state now, it's just so disconnected from the way Israelis are thinking about it. I think there was a vote in the Knesset last month. I don't remember the exact language, but 99 out of 120 Knesset members voted against a Palestinian state. One senior Israeli official said to me, even Moses couldn't get 99 votes in the Knesset, so this was something. So I think they're looking at Palestinians differently, and that's one issue. On the other hand, I think you have a fierce determination. Look how we've seen, you see, probably everyone has read these anecdotes. Israelis coming back from America, God knows where, to fight in the war. You had tremendous divisions in the country. I don't think they've gone away, they've just been kind of, you know, I think, for lack of a better word, buried, or for now. But you could see them starting to resurface in Israel. But all the rancor that you had and the phenomenal division that really was, at least I can't remember. Maybe you can, Alan. In this country went away immediately. Everyone united. Everyone realized this was important. This is a noble war. Everyone had a fight in. There was tremendous spirit, and I think actually, it's something that was a signal to the Iranians. Maybe it wasn't the best time to poke Israel anymore because the country is really hyped up. One of the billboards that was striking that I saw, I was shortly after the war began was, and you still see it, Yachad Ninatzeach, together we will be victorious. And, Yachad, together, because the country was so not together before. And it's impressive. And you see it in the war cabinet. And you see Benny Gantz working with Bibi and Gallant, even if they don't really all get along so well personally, they're working together. So I think that shows something very impressive about the country. And we got to commend these soldiers, the reservists, and the young soldiers, the draftees who are fighting what must be a horrendous sort of battle in Gaza. So I think that's the positive of what's going on in Israel, obviously in response to this just unbearable tragedy.
Can you explain to the audience what type of military Israel has? What I mean by that is that it's a civilian-based military, and that it's not professional in the sense of that it's 24 hours a day on the job. Well, they're on the job, but it's limited and it takes quite a bit to mobilize the country when in fact Israel is attacked like it was on October 7th. What type of military does Israel have?
Right.
Struck.
It's a reserve-based military, reservist-based military. I mean, it's a citizen army. We don't have that here in America. My organization, the JINSA, we deal with a lot of American military, a lot of retired generals involved with us. And we have, as some have told me, almost a caste-based kind of system in a way where the military, U.S. military, I don't know the statistics. I just know it anecdotally. You meet a soldier, their father or their mother was in the military, their kids are in the military, and basically a sliver of American society, relatively speaking. In Israel, that's not the case. Overwhelming amount of the country goes into the military. The people who aren't are some of the Arabs, although you do have some Arabs, but most Arabs don't serve. And of course, the ultra Orthodox Jews don't, and they don't want to, although some have volunteered since October 7th. But there's a whole dispute recently about whether more should be um, mandated to serve. But generally speaking, it's a civilian military, so people know what's going on. Their kids are in the military. They were in the military. Their friends are in the military. If there's a death, if there's a casualty, they all feel it. I don't know what somebody knows somebody who knows that person or they're a relative. It's terrible. Everyone feels it. It's a country of 9 million people. There've been something like, I think it's either 249 or 250 IDF casualties since the ground incursion, not counting what happened on October 7th. On a per capita basis, um, that is far more than we lost in many years in Iraq and Afghanistan. We lost, I think, about 4,400 soldiers in Iraq over all those years, which obviously is 4,400 too many, but Israel's 250 per capita is actually a lot more. So every death matters. I think it's a very moral army, but also I think what stands out is that the reservists. When October 7th happened, you had, and I don't know the exact numbers. I think it's higher than the reports. The reports say over 300,000 were called up. It might have been over 400,000. I don't know, and it might have been even higher than that. You had Israelis who were called to service and those who volunteered for service, even those who were on the older end. Country came together. Well, that's different than a lot of other militaries, certainly the kind of military that we have. And I also think because it's a civilian army and because of the society Israel has, I think it's also a very moral army. It's certainly not less of a moral army than we have here in the United States.
People can learn more about your organization, JINSA, by going to jinsa.org. Can you, in capsule form, explain what is JINSA's role?
Yeah, thanks. I appreciate it. In short, it stands for Jewish Institute for National Security of America. We were founded in 1976. I'd say in the pro-Israel, we focus on security issues in the Middle East. That's our focus. We deal and in the pro-Israel spectrum, we deal with the military. I'd say we're our organization in Washington closest to the IDF and also closest to the Pentagon. Historically, the American Jewish community has not really gravitated to the Pentagon as much as, let's say, Congress, which is obvious, AIPAC, White House, and so on. The Pentagon is a little more of a tougher building to deal with, and that's kind of our specialty. We have education programs for active duty U.S. military. Our base is Israel in the sense our base of our focus is Israel. So we bring active duty and retired American senior officers to Israel. For the retired, we involve them in our other parts of our organization, like our policy work. We also bring active duty IDF majors, colonels, generals to America to learn about U.S. foreign policy. So it's a way for each country to understand each other better, for their militaries to understand. We also work with other partner militaries, Arab and other countries in the region, with some of our programs. In our policy work, we focus on U.S.-Israel security. We focus on Iran. We focus on regional security. But we tend to deal with big issues like, let's say, we are strongly against the Iran nuclear deal. And we're the only ones calling for Israel being part of the Central Command area of responsibility, the U.S. Central Command's area of responsibility. We also the only one calling for a U.S.-Israel security mutual defense treaty. But also we'll deal with issues that, like weapons, what weapons Israel needs, what weapons our allies need. A lot of things that a lot of other organizations aren't really focused on.
Well, Michael, I thank you for all that you've done and all that you're going to do. Bibi's father used to say, he used to use that term, thanks a lot for what you did for me now and what you're going to do for me in the future. But I know you guys will continue to provide important analysis, advocacy, and I invite you back to do our podcast whenever you have something that you would like to present to the American public. And great to have you as a friend. And thank you for spending some time with us.
Alan, it's always great to talk to you, whether on a podcast or off. So anytime you want.
Excellent. Take care. Bye-bye.
Thanks for listening to the Code Red Podcast. Be sure to click subscribe to stay up to date and be the first to hear about our future podcast. You can also find and subscribe to the Code Red Podcast on Podbean, Spotify, Google Play, and YouTube.